Santa Rosa is totally destroyed and no one knows how many lives are lost. The business houses and all destroyed, nothing left of 4th Street and the adjoining streets. The earthquake threw down all the large buildings and they are a mass of debris. Our house is all right, although we thought ours would surely go, as it is not braced any too well. Miss O'Mara was in her house when it went down like a house of blocks. The house next went the same way. We haven't a house down out our way, and, of course, we're in no danger from fire. But to see poor Santa Rosa, it will take 20 years to get anything like it was.
The earthquake of 1906 devastated the downtown area, but amazingly, many buildings survived and are still here to this day. In the West End district of Santa Rosa, we find the Deturk Round barn. Why do you think that this building survived the 1906 earthquake?
Well, what we see in the earthquake was that the buildings that came down were primarily the masonry buildings. They had plaster, brick, masonry, things of that sort. Wooden buildings tend to have more give to them, so they could flop back and forth in the earthquake and still survive. Plus this building, remember, is round. So a round structure is like a barrel. It's a very strong type of a structure and can stand quite a bit.
I see.
It was built of redwood, and of course in those days, 1890 when it was built, clear hard virgin redwood, 1,500-year-old trees were readily available. So the structure is virgin clear hard redwood, which of course nowadays would cost you a fortune if you could find it, but that's what the structure is, so it's very it's not susceptible to rot and other problems that buildings have. And we feel that he had seen round barns of this sort on the East Coast where they had been popular from the 1860s and built it for a couple reasons. One, a round barn is more secure than a square barn. It's a solider building because of the round nature of it. But I think it was more of an affectation. It was kind of a symbol. I've done really well. I can have this beautiful round building with this clear span. It was also easy to exercise horses inside here in inclement weather. You had like open space.
Sure.
And then you had all these nice little stalls around here for each one of your prize racehorses. He had 18 stalls in here.
Wow.
Isaac Turk was an interesting man who was born in Pennsylvania in the 1830s, I believe it was. By 1862, he was producing substantial quantities of wine. And that wine became so well known that within a few years, he was one of the biggest shippers of wine in California, and his wine was on the East Coast and even in Europe. Across the street here on Donahue, he had his wine-making facilities right along the railroad and the brick buildings that still stand across the street.
So did the brick buildings survive the earthquake?
They did. There's quite a few buildings along here, as you know. One building had been built right after the railroad arrived in 1870, and apparently Deturk, it had burned down, and Deturk apparently came back and rebuilt that and started his winemaking over there.
Our next stop is the Church of the One Tree at Juilliard Park.
So Bill, tell me about this church. It survived the earthquake, and what was it used for immediately after the earthquake?
Well, we believe it was used for a shelter. A lot of people in town lost their homes, so they had need to spend someplace for the night, so it was used as a shelter for a period of time. It was also apparently damaged in the earthquake. The steeple, which you see here, was about 40 feet taller before the earthquake, more of a Gothic steeple than it is now. And shortly after the earthquake, the steeple disappeared, and by 1910 there was a very short steeple here. And then later on it was rebuilt to this height, which is about 40 foot shorter than the earthquake damaged steeple. In 1873-74, when the church lumber was ordered from a mill in Stumptown, which is now Guerneville, the owner of the lumber mill decided he could fill the entire order for that church, which was a tremendous amount of wood, out of one redwood log. So he did so, shipped it to Santa Rosa. The First Baptist Church of Santa Rosa was built at a different location. And years later, he came forth with affidavits, testimony from the other workers at the mill, swearing to the authenticity of the church being built from one redwood log. It was moved here in 1959 to save it from being torn down for a parking lot up at on 5th Street where it originally stood. And for a while, its use went back and forth, and then about, I believe, in the late 70s, it started as a Ripley Museum, and then operated as a Ripley Museum until about 1996 or 97. Now, where it is right now, it's hard to find, frankly, because it backs onto Sonoma Avenue. It's in a beautiful setting in the park, but most people don't know where it is. It has no parking. It has neighbors on either side, so it's very difficult to use it for any public assembly. So the ultimate decision has been to move it down the street about 1,000 feet, right across from City Hall in Sonoma Avenue Park at the foot of D Street, and to open it up as a reservable meeting hall for weddings, lectures, small recitals, things of that sort. And of course, it needs the money to move it and to restore it there, and then we can start doing that.
The Church of the Incarnation was put to a much different use.
This was the morgue, and they had a rectory next to it that was brand new but terribly destroyed, in that all the plaster fell off the walls and other things were broken. The chimney fell down, and they used that as a hospital. So the people who didn't survive were moved over to here, or they brought people from the area who had died. Reverend Burleson, he remembered awakening at 5-something in the morning and to the earthquake. And then he found all the devastation around him and the number of dead and dying. And the people came in to help dig them out and find the people who were under buildings. And then they brought them into the church. And the rectory couldn't be used after that for a while until they rebuilt it. And the outside walls expanded, pushed out about 8 inches. And they left that there until the 1930s. It was left that way until they redid the building and they had put the buttresses there to pull it in and to hold it together. The original church was built of 2 redwood trees, and they planned it because they thought they'd enlarge. So when, about 8 years later, they quartered it and pulled it out. And you can see along the side walls where some of the pews were. They were against the wall at that time. And to me, it was amazing that they could quarter a building and expand it. It was this size at the time of the earthquake. And women's organizations at that time did so many things. In fact, they bought the first organ for the church, but they also contributed. And that's how we rebuilt the rectory. And then later, of course, but contributing our own funds, we repaired the church. The only thing really that was broken in the church then was the font. And I find no record of whether the windows were broken, which seems strange to me.
Another strange miracle was the survival of Luther Burbank's greenhouse.
According to Burbank, not even a pane of glass was broken, not a tinder plant destroyed during the earthquake. And it was important for him to broadcast that message because he was receiving $10,000 a year from the Carnegie Foundation in order to further his plant experiments, and a lot of that happened here in the greenhouse. So the Carnegie folks came and inspected earthquake damage only less than a month after the earthquake happened. So he had to have his operations up and running and continuing during that time period. Burbank was awake during the earthquake at 5 in the morning, and he witnessed it and wrote detailed accounts of what happened during the earthquake. He saw wave-like motions and trees swaying in unusual circular patterns. He went downtown and he helped to pull survivors from a hotel called the Grand Hotel. And he said it was a horrible experience with all of the devastation and the death that he witnessed. And he really wrote about it very briefly. He said that was about as much as he wanted to talk about that aspect of things. They enlisted the railroads here. They still had railroad service that wasn't damaged, and railroads brought special train cars, empty cars, and they were filled with rubble from the buildings and then removed from town and probably dumped in the bay. Soon thereafter, he and other city backers wanted to promote the idea that the city was returning to form. He wanted, and the city of Santa Rosa wanted, to be sure that people knew that the city was still open for business and continuing and moving on.